early the next spring, I walked out in this bee yard and kind of, there's still some snow and ice on the ground, and dead bees are being thrown out. And I just had this uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. And I didn't know what it was, and I walked around, and just this unsettledness. As I looked around, I finally discovered this water heater was missing. And I think some deer hunter was coming through the woods, because this farmer was very gracious in letting people hunt there. Probably saw this scrap iron, and this is back in the day when scrap iron had more value than it does today. And I bet they rolled that into their pickup truck and took it someplace. And I bet it, with all the honey in there, it probably weighed a ton. And needless to say, I wonder if anybody ever got the urge to cut that open or try and salvage anything out of there and found all that honey. But anyhow, you try and help people. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Anyhow, that's where we're at. And I'm going to close here to see if we got any questions that have come through. And I am done sharing my screen. So I do have some Q&A. Is that where we're going on this?
I think so. Great job, Grant. Everything was fantastic to hear. What I wanted to mention was Laura Faust sent me a message while you were talking and wanted to remind me to remind all the viewers that we as a club still have nucleus colonies available. If there's anyone out there who, after hearing what you had to say, decided, hey, maybe I want to expand, maybe I need a nucleus colony for a hive that had died, we have that available still. So get them while you can. So
yeah, the availability of nukes is really limited. And it's one of those things that if you want to do it, you really got to get on it. And again, I'm going to go back to this idea of, we don't really expand just for the sense of expanding, but when you get even another nuke just to hold as a spare, now you've got more resources, and you set that up. And if you've got a colony that's failing, you can pull frames out of that. I just can't say enough about having multiple colonies mostly for the resources to help strengthen others that you got.
Exactly. So some Q&A that's coming in. Maybe I can read a couple of them to you, Grant.
Okay.
What is the minimum nighttime temperature when it is safe to add a second deep to a single deep hive coming out of winter?
Oh, that's one of those $1 million questions. I think one of the things I think about is when you put a second brood box or even a super on top of another colony, there's heat that escapes and it moves up. I would say, and again, I don't even like to feed one-to-one syrup until the nighttime temperatures are above 50 degrees. And for some reason, 50 degrees is kind of my rule of thumb. We like also to say is don't open a colony unless it's a day where it's 60 degrees. I don't know if there's any science behind that, but those are our rules of thumb. And so I would say if the nighttime temperature is above 50, I think you're okay. You're not going to lose that much heat. I'd go with 50 degrees. And again, that's an opinion. This is advice based on experience. If I said, no, don't do it till it's 80 degrees, by then your colony is probably swarmed. And now I've given you some really bad advice.
That's right. A question here from Tim. You mentioned putting a swarm lure into a hive that died over the winter. But what if you don't know how the hive died or what it died from, and varroa mites might have been the cause? Won't the swarm you caught be in trouble?
I'd say no. I think the varroa mites froze out as well. The varroa mites need bees to live. If let's suppose it was a virus. Now we're talking about something more on a micro biological level, but viruses need a host. And so I think the freezing killed off everything that's dead. The mites will be dead. The swarm could move in there, and then the swarm will start cleaning it out. But there's something about a dead colony that signals the pheromones in the brood comb that tells another swarm this was a good place to live. And maybe it'd be a better place if the beekeeper took better care of them. So,
Exactly.
so I don't get worked up about that. And, you know, now if it's American foul brood, now we're talking about a whole different ball game. And I don't think American foul brood is as prevalent as we fear, but it's still something that has to be respected because you can't cure it. You can only suppress it. And nowadays we've got that stupid, and I say stupid, again, that's an opinion. We've got this requirement to get the veterinary directive to get the prescription for the oxytetracycline that we need to suppress the American foul brood. But again, we're not going to cure anything. We're just going to suppress the symptoms to give the bees a chance.
Exactly. I'm often amazed at what an amazing job bees will do when you introduce a swarm or a new colony into a dead out. I always tell people the dead bees that are inside the comb head first that died, let the new colony take care of that. I've heard of people trying to use tweezers and try to pull those bees out. And I tell people the bees that you get, the new colony will make short work of that. And
yep,
there's no reason to, all you're going to do is damage the comb, you know. So they have cleaned up in my bee yard a lot of colonies or a comb that was just not very attractive looking and made it look pretty amazing.
Well, I've had a colony move into a colony that died from I said, bees, wax moths don't kill a colony. They're opportunistic. They move into a colony that's on the way down. And sometimes I get procrastinating, and here's this colony that died in the fall. The wax moth moved in. They made a mess. Sometimes a swarm does move in. They'll clean it up, but they don't clean up everything. And a lot of times they'll propolize all those wax moths' cocoons, and they'll pull out the webbing, and then they move in. But now because the comb has been destroyed, now they start doing their own thing. That's what you get for procrastinating.
That's right. That's one of the take-home messages from this evening.
Right.
Don't do that. All right, let's see. What happens? Janet's asking, what would happen if you left all the queen cells during a reverse split?
They fight. Somewhere along the lines, there's going to be the lone surviving queen. And it may be that first queen that comes out and she dispatches all the competition. When I've been doing this reverse split, especially down in Southeast Missouri, there were times in the early spring, it takes 7 days to get that capped queen cell. Sometimes it was so wet, so rainy, and so muddy, I could not get back to that bee yard. And the next thing I knew, by the time I got back, there was a queen. She was mated, she was laying, she was doing her thing. She's the only one I found. So somehow they know how to work out those details. I don't think the other ones come out and swarm. I think they just fight. Mel Dieselcone, who kind of does this OTS, on-the-spot queen rearing, his theory, I've never heard any science to back it up, but again, it's an opinion. I respect Mel, and so I thought, oh, okay. He believes that when you've got like that frame and there's 9 queen cells, you should smash all but 2. Because if the virgins are fighting, by the time they fly out on their mating flight, they're too exhausted to make it back, and you end up with a queenless colony. Now, okay, I've never heard anyone else espouse that opinion, and that's Mel's opinion. I like Mel, so I'm not going to argue, but I'm going to say, I have to think about that one.
Exactly. I don't have any evidence to the contrary, so I guess you have to take his opinion at what it is, and I've never heard that. So I've heard a lot of discussions over the years. Do you leave 2 queen cells? Do you leave 1? You know, and you know, I go back and forth on that myself. Sometimes I just leave 1, trying to really limit their options. Sometimes I leave 2.
Well, I'll tell you this, I have left 1, and then in my inexperience of putting those frames back in, I've accidentally squished that 1. And then I hope maybe I can find another colony that has swarmed so I can borrow those queen cells. So I leave 2 just in the event I accidentally, inadvertently damage that 1. And if they're hanging like this off the bottom of a frame, you can't put that box on top of another box. You've got to put those frames down on the bottom. So they've
Exactly.
got that little space where they can hang.
Mm-hmm. All right. Looks like Elaine's asking, is a 3-mile separation required when you do make a split? She's worried about the bees flying back to the parent colony.
I have had experience where I've made splits, kept them in the neighboring yard. I come back the next day and all the bees have left. And they've abandoned brood, they've abandoned stores, and of course by now it starts getting robbed out. I can't remember where I started doing this, but oh goodness, there's a fellow named Jim Buxton.
Yep.
Jim Buxton. Well, he taught me this. He says if you make a nuke and you close it up and you can store it in a cool place for 24 hours, those bees decide this is home and they'll stay. So a lot of times I just put a screen over the entrance when I make a nuke, and I put it inside a shed and I put some duct tape around the top so the lid doesn't come off. After 24 hours isolated, I've never had any problem with them leaving. But the problem is you can't leave that sitting out on a honey stand in the sunshine, or hive stand rather, in the sunshine, or it just gets too hot.
Exactly.
So I've never had any problem with that. And some people say you put a stick in front of it or some cut brush or whatever. But no, you don't have to move them 3 miles. But unless you think that's going to work and you've got someplace 3 miles away, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm not saying I do. However, when I was in southeast Missouri and had more bees, because these nukes have to be fed, I was moving them all to one bee yard. Most of those were coming from more than 3 miles away, but the bees never seemed to leave. They didn't want to swarm out. And then I had some nukes that stayed in the same bee yard. And in early spring, that's okay. July and August, now you got some robbing potential. And so if you make some late splits, I'm not too sure I want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now here's a question that I remember struggling with when I first got into beekeeping, because a lot of the techniques that they recommend for stopping swarming would be to have the addition of drawn comb. And so David is asking, how do I get drawn comb in time for bees to use it to prevent swarming? And so I've got an answer for that, and I'm sure you do too. So you go ahead and start it off.
Well, if you don't have drawn comb and you're feeding or there's a nectar flow going on, you would be surprised how fast those bees will draw out that foundation. More so if it's wax foundation than plastic. I like plastic foundation, but my bees are not as enthusiastic about it. So I've added more wax to it. That's a whole nother conversation and a whole nother talk. So if I'm trying to expand that brood nest, I'll put in a frame with wired wax foundation, and I've got both. I've got so much junk in my shed. I can find some frames. In fact, I found some frames I didn't even know I had, and I've got the foundation. And I'm one of those types of people that think if you need these resources, I don't want to have to sit down, find a catalog, and then order them only to find out it's back ordered. So I've got stuff like that, but feed them, give them a reason to draw the comb out, especially if there's a nectar flow going out. And then if you put that foundation between two frames of brood, those bees will really jump on it then. So that's my thoughts.
Gotcha. This wouldn't help a first-year beekeeper, but one of the things that I do every year, and again, it's just something that you kind of try, and it worked out for me, was to use a deep as a super on a very strong colony. And then you have to have a way of extracting a deep frame. Some extractors won't accommodate a deep frame. So if you do have those options to use a deep as a super, extract the honey, and then you've got 10 frames of beautifully drawn comb that you can store over winter, and then you have it for the following spring. And so it's one of those things that I do the year before in anticipation of needing it the following spring.
Yes.
So that's just what works for me, but like you say, putting the foundation between And I think it's important that you said between brood, because that really does force them to jump on it, you know, and they don't seem to draw it out really fat, like I've seen them do occasionally before, where they draw it for honey storage really, and the cells are, you know, 1.5 inches wide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So looks like Steve's asking, when do you think it's possible to swap the top and the bottom, so to do a reversal?
Well, right now, I think it's just a little bit too cool. It's really hard to judge by the calendar. But again, when the nights start getting 50 degrees or the bees, of course, it all depends on how much honey is left over in that upper brood box. Sometimes I'll add a third brood box, but I try and keep all the brood in the middle of those 3 boxes and then leave sometimes some blank or the honey storage on the sides. We call it chimneying, where the bees like to stay in the center. And again, that's one of those $1 million questions. If I had done it today, cold, winds of 7,000 miles per hour blowing across the prairie, that's what makes me nervous. But I like it warm, and this is why I like to insulate those colonies, which again, I'm not saying that's the way to do it. I'm not saying that's the necessary thing that works. I'm just trying to make the best of my bees that I can.
Very good. Nedra is asking how much the nukes that the club is offering, how much are they? And I believe they're $185 for the 5-frame deep nukes. So again, if you're in the need for a nuke, definitely check out the club's website and put your order in now while you can. We've got an anonymous attendee who's asking, do you feed 1-to-1 sugar mix in the spring? When and what helps you make the decision? And how about now if they still have some stores just to stimulate them?
I think it's too cold right now. Again, it's chilly, and if the air temperature is cold and you've got that sugar syrup like sitting above the brood box, or if you're like some of these people that like to use these Boardman feeders that slide in the entrance, which again, my opinion is those things are the biggest waste of money I've ever seen. Later in the summer, they're just going to cause robbing, and sometimes it's the hornets that rob them out. But 50 degrees, and quite frankly, you don't have to feed very much to stimulate them, especially if they've got honey. If you feed them too much, now you're mimicking this incoming nectar flow, which they have to store. You've got a queen that wants to lay eggs. And the old timers used to say, if you feed them, they're going to swarm. Well, what they were saying is if you feed them too much, you fill up all these cells with this incoming syrup. The queen wants to lay eggs, and now you've got the congestion, and now it triggers swarming. But I think if there's lots of open cells yet, if the brood cluster is still pretty small, they got stores, you could feed them. I mean, they really prefer to feed the nectar as opposed to the honey. Honey is really a winter storage food. Nectar is a spring brood food.
Exactly. I see a lot of questions about that when I scroll through Facebook about people who are just feeding. They feel that that's what's required, and they have yet to go in, do an inspection. They don't have any idea what's going on in the nest. They just feel that they see people recommending feeding, and that's what they think they need to do. And, you know, I think some of what I'm taking away from what you're saying is that you probably should have an idea of what's going on, how much they have stored before you just continue to feed, because you could be causing the problems that you're describing with too much nectar at one time and they can't deal with it.
I was at my bees yesterday, and what we were noticing is they are getting nectar from somewhere. I was working with another beekeeper, and we were speculating, is that water that they're bringing in, water that they would use to dilute the honey to feed the larva? So we stuck our fingers in this comb, and it was sweet. It was a very, very thin nectar. And I'm looking around trying to figure out what in the world is blooming. They're bringing in pollen, but I don't see anything in bloom. there was enough that coming in that we didn't think we needed to feed because they've got resources coming in. And so if the bees were starving, that'd be one thing. If it was going to be, a week of rainy, chilly weather, I'd consider feeding. But if you don't need to feed, to me, that's just extra time, labor, and money.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Okay, just looks like we've got a question here. I'm sorry, we had 3 colonies die this fall, but there was a lot of honey left in the hives. We opened up the hives and the 3 remaining hives are cleaning out the honey. My question is, the frames that were in these deeps that we lost are really dark in color. Should we replace the foundation, which is about 6 years old?
Oh, if it's 6 years old, it's probably getting kind of dark. And we do have this practice of rotating out old, dark comb because we feel that these combs become like a sponge. And especially if you're a chemical treater, every time you put the treatments in, there's a little residue that is stored. And what we're finding out is these combs are being recycled and the wax is rendered out of it. There are still chemicals, miticides, in these combs. I like the darker combs to use for swarm traps and my dummy hives that I'm using to attract swarms. We like to say it takes 7 or 8 pounds of honey to make a pound of wax. So you don't want to necessarily force your bees to expend all these calories just to draw out more comb. But if you start thinking about the freshness of drawn, brand new comb and how it isn't all contaminated, yeah, okay. What's 7 or 8 pounds of honey? Because there's not that much wax in a beehive. It's not like you've got 50 pounds of wax that needs now 350 pounds of honey. When you melt down a frame, you get this teeny tiny little thimble of wax and you think, where did it all go? Well, it's all space. So I'm a big proponent in believing that if combs look kind of gunky, swap them out. So I'm a big believer in that. But I mean, the honey would still probably be good if you didn't put any chemicals in there or if you didn't feed any sugar syrup. You could render it out for human consumption, but I don't think I'd feed it to bees.
Right. Okay, we've got a question here that is off topic, but would it be safe to eat honey from my neighbor's house that had a bunch of bees, I guess, growing in the rafters of the house, and the bees were sprayed with pesticides?
Oh, okay. I don't think I would.
No.
Now, if I was a starving man, I might, but I've had people call me about swarms and I get this phone call, you got to come right away. They're all stirred up. I'm thinking, wait a minute, why? If it's a swarm, they usually cluster and they hang there. If they're stirred up, they're leaving. And then the people who call me about the swarm, they say, well, we sprayed them with pesticides or we sprayed them with wasp killer. And that's when I say, they're all yours. I'm not going to mess with them. Can you imagine just the consumer apprehension if somebody said, yeah, Grant took those bees back to his place and he's selling honey? I don't want any part of that. In fact, quite frankly, I think it'd be better just go to another beekeeper and buy their fresh honey. I wouldn't worry about that stuff in the rafters.
Exactly. I would stay away from it myself. That doesn't sound like something that you want to put in your body.
Well, wait a minute, John. Don't you have somebody you don't like? Here, have some free honey.
Okay.
They'll think you're a champ.
Exactly. Yeah, you're the hero. We had a weak queen. She wasn't well mated going into winter. They survived. We're not confident they'll make it into the next winter. Will the bees replace her this year, or should I get rid of her so they replace her this spring?
Again, it depends on what your purpose is. If you want a colony really strong to make honey, I'd replace her. But I wouldn't necessarily kill her. I would move her to a nuke. And I've had some bees that have sat there in the spring and they didn't do anything. And of course, I blame the queen. We always blame the queen. Next thing I know is I have moved them off the side in their own box, or if I've just ignored them, all of a sudden, for some reason, I don't know if it's the nectar that's coming in, if it's the pollen coming in, or if they're waiting for the temperature or the day length, but all of a sudden, boom, they kick in. And so I see a whole bunch of bees coming out, and I'll open up that box and they put burr comb all over the place because they've decided it's time to go. But again, if you're just keeping bees for fun and just want to learn from them and watch them, they'll replace her if she's bad. And this is where I think we've got to learn to kind of trust the bees. If they're making a supersedure cell, my first inclination is always to scratch that out because you don't want that disruption. But somewhere they know that the old queen is failing, even if you see lots of brood. And supersedure cells would be just 1 or 2 or 3, not 15 or 20. So we presume that's a supersedure cell. But they know what's going on. They know there's something not right. So I'm inclined to let that supersedure cell mature and let that queen come out. But I also mark my queens. So I've got the old queen marked, and I'll make a note on that colony to come back. And if I can find that mated daughter, I'll mark her with a different color. And then I want to see, do they survive? And I've only had this happen once where I could find that daughter that superseded, had the old queen there, came back a couple weeks later, and I found another queen, unmarked. So that was another supersedure cell, but the colony was doing well. Of course, it was behind schedule, but man, my goodness, the new daughter kicked in. And so I just take over and let that colony get back on schedule, and I don't worry about it. But I think in this case, I would just let the bees do their thing. Generally, they know to replace that queen, and sometimes that's a better deal than trying to buy a new queen and introduce her.
And I like that you mentioned that we always tend to blame the queen for any problems that we have. And often there might be something unrelated to her, a lack of foragers or another problem that's, an imbalance of nectar incoming that could cause a problem with her production. And you might put her into a nuke and she might take off. So I'm like you, I've had that happen before where you put her aside and then I used her resources, her frames of brood to bolster other colonies that maybe are trying to take off also. So unless there's a need to kill her, I usually will try to stick her in a nuke and try to get some use out of her. Deborah is asking about, should I put she's written D cozy, I'm assuming she means bee cozy, back on my hive. She took it off with these warm days, but looks like we're in for some cooler temperatures.
I don't think so, unless if it's going to help you sleep at night, yes. But I think we are beyond that extended cold weather that would keep the bees locked in. I think if you put it back on, the days are going to change. I've seen some of these bee cozies. They're black and they're thin insulation. I think they help, but that's more of a winter thing. And I think the bees, as they begin to develop more brood, I think we're going to have more bees that'll take over, and I would say no.
I agree. I wasn't able to fully treat for mites last fall. 2 hives died. Is there something I can do this spring for my existing colony?
Yeah, I think so. Since I'm in the honey business, I don't feed a lot during the spring. And I don't want to put any chemical treatments in there because now because I like to put on supers early just to prevent swarming and give them extra room. So I'm very sensitive about the waiting time. But I think you could treat, if you really want to, like with this Apivar, and that's the white strips. It's a chemical called amitraz. And I think the directions are, if you put them in the springtime, it's going to take 2 brood cycles, which is like 42 days. But after you take those strips out, and there's a reason they give you directions on these things, take them out. And I think you've got to wait 2 weeks before you put your supers on. I don't understand the chemical. I don't understand how that chemical works. That is, if you put them in the colony, does it take 2 weeks for that residue to dissipate? But there's a reason why they have these instructions. And the instructions are, if you put the chemical in, you've got to wait 2 weeks. So if you think about where we're at now, the middle of March, 42 days would probably put us 1st of May. And then if you wait 2 weeks, now you're about the middle of May, Mother's Day. That's really when the nectar flow kicks in. You could do that if that's what you want to do. But again, you do you, I'll do me. And I'm not going to be critical of somebody who says, I need to put these chemicals in because I didn't do it in the fall. Man, I mean, if it keeps your bees alive, you got to do what you got to do.
Exactly. Better to miss out on a little bit of the honey harvest and have a live colony than to forego whatever treatment they deem necessary, you know, and have a dead colony. So
John, let me just tell you this from experience. Dead colonies are really bad honey producers.
I'll take your word for that.
Right.
Let's see. We've got another question. What about the frames that still have honey in them in the dead out? Do you leave them in the hive too?
Yeah. You know, eventually, if there's honey that's left there, it's going to get robbed out. I don't think a swarm's going to move in and take advantage of it. I think there's other bees that will sense that honey in there, and it's a free resource to them. Again, it goes back, do I know why they died? And if they died from lack of mite protocols, or did they starve? Well, they wouldn't have starved out if there's extra honey, but maybe the cluster was too small and they couldn't reach that honey. The other colonies are going to clean that out, so I'm not too worried about it. Or could you take it off and give it to another colony? Maybe that would be even more responsible than just letting the bees, whatever bees, because you could get the bees that are coming in from the woods across the highway.
Very true. And yeah, if they have a dead out and they know there's still honey resources in there, put it in a location that's bee tight and use it for your other colonies, you know, block the entrance so that you can use that honey the way you feel the need for it, and not just let it go to, as Grant said, just to whatever bees are around. Let's see. I've heard mixed things on reversing hive boxes in early spring. If bees already cover both of the deeps, is it necessary if that's their condition that they find their colonies?
Wow, I would say no. If you got bees in 2 deeps, it's either time to put on some supers or even add a 3rd brood box. Now, I find some pushback from that because everybody presumes 2 deeps is all you need. There's a lot of people in Canada, they go to 1 deep. And who's that gentleman in the MSBA? Steve Mulder?
Familiar.
Well, my brain isn't functioning. He likes keeping bees in a single deep. But if you've got bees in 2 deeps, well, I would add a 3rd deep, and then I would bring some of those frames from the bottom boxes up to that 3rd box and put some new frames in between, because that's going to be a really good honey producer, or it's going to swarm.
Exactly. In the slide with the insulation and the mouse hole, the insulation was under another box. What's in that upper box?
Air. What I like to do is, the insulation was sitting on a thicker board. That thicker board, it's actually a 1x2. That's my inner cover. If I'm feeding over that inner cover, and sometimes I just want to give them a little bit, so I just invert a half-gallon jar. If I'm really feeding heavy, like we're in a dearth, I'll put on a 2-gallon bucket, but I put it above the inner cover. I need something to go around it. A 2-gallon bucket from the bakery will fit, but I need that deep to go around it. Now, I used to haul all those empty deep brood boxes out, feed, and then I'd haul all those brood boxes back to my storage shed. Then I got thinking, why don't I just leave them on? So people ask me that. So it looks like I've got a brood box on top of my supers. And they go, how can that be? Well, it's okay. If it's a brood box with frames, now it becomes a deep honey super. Bees don't look at a deep and say, I'm only going to use that for brood. They'll store wherever. So it's really just an empty box that I didn't want to take back to my shed. I've taken the honey, the syrup feeder off. That goes back to my shed. It's just a box that's sitting on top of that blue foam board. And I just see no reason to take it back.
It saves you a lot of lifting when you've got a lot of colonies back and forth.
Yeah, and invariably, I always seem to forget what I need. So I need to go back and get what I need. If it's like Scott Moser, who says every bee yard he has, he's got a tree, pounds a nail in the tree and hangs a hive tool. And that way he's got a hive tool every place he goes, he never forgets.
That's a good plan. Larry's got a little bit of information. He said last year that in his observation hive, the bees made about 7 queen cells. Most of the queens hatched. It appears the bees killed all the virgins except one, and then the bees continued to carry these dead queens around for days. I guess I would have thought they would have had access to take them outside, but I don't know why they chose to carry them around for several days.
Maybe this is like those medieval warriors if you watch that movie, The Last Kingdom, where they put all the vanquished, defeated warriors on sticks or strung them up. Maybe this is to parade the other bees around and say, don't follow this one. This one's dead. Go back to the one that's live. She's our new queen.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Let's see. I got 4 nukes last spring. 2 colonies gave me 120 pounds of honey. 2 nukes gave me 0. All look strong right now. Should I requeen the 2 weak colonies, weak in their production? Can I pull nukes or split all 4 of them?
Well, that's a question that's more art than science. Conceivably, you could. I would pull nukes off the stronger colonies first, see if the other ones can catch up with more brood, more strength. It may be they're better off left unsplit if you want to produce honey. But it sounds like he had a couple of really good nukes that produced some honey for him. And that's, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but every time I teach a beginning beekeeping class, I tell people, don't promise your significant other that we're going to get all this free honey for Christmas gifts, because your first year, you just never know. So I think I'd rather tell people, pretend you're going to leave the honey for the bees. If you get some extra, that would be fine too. Now, in one of our Jackson bee meetings, there's a father-daughter team, and the father brought in this pint jar. They had said, we're not going to take any honey the first year. We're going to leave it all for the bees, because this is kind of the consensus of all the beginner beekeeping classes. This is their opinion. This is their advice. But they just couldn't leave all of it. So they took one frame, crush and strain, got a pint of honey. As he laid it on the table, he said, this is our first harvest. It only cost $1,200 a pound.
That's exactly right. The most expensive honey you'll ever eat.
That's right. So no, you kind of got to look at it, and sometimes there's a judgment call. Do the queens look weak, and is it the problem with the queen? Do I requeen her? Or do I give her more opportunity? Does she need some more feed? Is there a problem with mites? And of course, doing an alcohol wash in the spring is really, really challenging, because you don't have enough mites, I think, to really get a good assessment. And I presume they're okay in the spring if I've done something in the fall to squash that population.
John's asking here, new beekeeper can buy better comb from Better Bee, and the queen will immediately lay eggs. I am solving my no comb as a first-year beekeeper with Better Comb.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I've seen it available at Isabee's, and got a chance to look at it, and it's amazing looking stuff. I mean, the technology to be able to make that is pretty cool. So
I've seen it too. Now, 10 years ago, we had plastic, all plastic, and they had a like super comb or some name for it. I don't know how that went, because it was like fully drawn plastic, and I don't know if the bees accepted that or not. I don't see a lot of it around, so maybe it didn't work out. But again, I marvel at these companies. We're always trying to help the bees and help the beekeepers and trying to use technology the best we can.
This next question could be a talk in and of itself. When would be the best time to do a split?
Oh, well, Mel Dieselcone, and again, I respect Mel, he says don't split a colony less than 8 frames of brood. And what we're talking about is, do you have something to split that has enough resources to continue to grow? But then I hear other people talk about making 2-frame splits. I don't know. I think it depends on if there's a lot of resources coming in terms of nectar and pollen. But if you make a split, will you lose the field bees that go back to the original colony? Do you need to feed it? That's, I don't know. That's a question I think I'd have to look at it. And then sometimes it's kind of an intuitive, it'll work on this one, but it won't work on this one. And I think this is where the role of a good mentor to come in and take a look. And I find this problem too with people who say, I can't find a mentor. Well, I'm not asking you to develop this long-term relationship with somebody. Sometimes people call me and they say, I just need you to come over for one afternoon. Just tell me what I'm looking at, and I'll give them some advice. That's all they need. I don't need to come back on a weekly schedule or every other week. But this mentoring thing, I think, is the most underutilized resource. We've got good, experienced beekeepers, and I'm not talking about these grumpy old men that look like Wilford Brimley. We're talking somebody with 5 years experience. They kind of know what's going on. They know how bees function. They're still a wonderful resource that could be used in a mentoring process. But I think we just think only grumpy old men can be mentors.
I agree that there's a lot of, I always tell people who are 3 or 4 or 5 years into their beekeeping journey, think about how much more you know now than you did when you started the first year, so you've got a lot of information to share. And as a new beginner, it really helps to have someone to bounce questions off of. So I would add that for me in my own bee yard, I try to make splits with mated queens if I can. Mm-hmm. So when do I do my splits? Well, when I get my queens, that's when I do my splits. Yeah. So that kind of dictates, because queens are very perishable, and you can't put them in the refrigerator and come back and get them later. You got to use them now. So
put them in the freezer instead.
Yeah, exactly. So you got to do it then. So that's when I tend to do mine. When should I place supers on in order to prevent swarming? Generally speaking, Grant, do you have like a calendar date that you usually try to shoot for to get your supers on?
I do, but every spring is different. The best time to put the super on is before they swarm. I'm thinking, and again, if you're feeding, you don't want to congest that brood nest. So I think middle of April, about the time the red buds bloom, then some nectar's coming in. They need someplace to store it. If you put a super, particularly if you got drawn comb, just above that double brood box, they'll start storing it there. If you're going to feed them just a little bit of one-to-one syrup to kind of stimulate them, they may store it in that nectar and pull it down. They may put it in the brood nest. That's about when I would add my first super, about the middle of April. And again, I'm still trying to learn the nectar flow up here in the Kansas City area, but down in the Boot Heel, about the middle of April, we start seeing swarms, and bees will swarm into a nectar flow. So when I start seeing the comb filled up with this real light, thin nectar, that tells me that's the time to add the supers, when they need the storage. But about Mother's Day, that's when the nectar flow really came on. It really got hot, really humid. That's when I added my other supers. And generally, if you can keep them from swarming till the nectar flow really kicks in, it's like they They changed their whole priority, and now they go, well, we're not going to swarm. Got all this nectar coming in. Let's do this. Which isn't to say they won't, but generally it's like they shift priorities.
I agree. I usually shoot for the middle of April, try to get them on. And again, everyone's schedule's different. It's so hard. You get busy, but that's what I shoot for, about April 15th.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Okay. Jenny's asking about your thoughts on the flow hive.
I don't have one. Now, what did I say at the beginning? That advice is opinions based on experience. I have no experience. I look at those and that's not for me, and that's okay. You do you, I'll do me. I've had some people who got a flow hive and I say, well, that's great. They ask me questions and I say, you need to find somebody who's got the flow hive and can make it work. I don't have one, and I'm really not interested in getting one. It just doesn't fit my style. I look at these two guys, this father and son team that either designed it or they did this incredible marketing job. I'm impressed. I'm also a little envious, but good for them. It's not for me. It's like I had a top bar hive and I think somebody gave it to me because they didn't like me. And that was the most frustrating thing. I could not get it to work. So when somebody comes and asks me about a top bar hive, I'll tell them my experience was very negative. I couldn't get it to work, but if I can encourage you, great. If you got a question that I can help you with, that's great, but I'm not the best resource to talk about a flow hive or a top bar hive.
Me either. So I don't have much to offer on that. Jim's asking, do you use queen excluders? Yes or no? And if not, why not?
Oh, I do. Now, I know there's some people who get really fastidious about they don't want any brood in their honey supers. That's great. You do you, I'll do me. I like the supers to be that cushion where the queen could lay eggs if she had to, if she's running out of room down below. I don't get worked up about brood in my honey super, but about the middle of June, I'm going to put a queen excluder on and then have my supers above it. So if there's any brood there, it'll age out. And then I put a new kind of an artificial rim around the top of the honey excluder. And bear in mind, there is a top and a bottom to honey excluder. And usually some of them are stamped, but the bars that run front to back, they've got to be on the top. The bars that run side to side are supposed to be on the bottom. And people didn't know that, and I don't know if that really works. But what I want to do is I want to put that on there, and I have a top entrance above the excluder so bees don't have to go in the bottom, come up, and then try and work their way through that excluder. Jerry Hayes did an experiment back in the early 1980s, and he discovered it really is what they call a honey excluder because bees have a tendency not to go through it, but they will deposit nectar in the brood nest, which now gets full of nectar and honey. The queen has less room to lay eggs, and if she doesn't swarm, she'll have less brood. But with the top entrance, the bees fly in above the brood nest, and they'll deposit more honey, or more nectar rather, and make more honey than if you only have the bottom entrance. So when I use a queen excluder, it's to age the brood, usually 3 weeks before I want to start harvesting. And then I have an upper entrance, and some of my supers are so rotten, those bad corners, they're my upper entrance.
That's pretty good. Looks like here is FYI, the Honeybee Health Coalition has a Varroa management tool to help you navigate treatments, no treatments, and what to use. And so I would say, yes, that is probably the best resource for, and I've got an image I took on my cell phone of that website and that Varroa management guide. And when I'm on Facebook and I see people start asking questions about what should I use to treat, when should I treat, all these treatment questions, usually the first thing I do is send them that image so they can use that as their resource, because to me it's probably the best resource out there for anyone who has questions about what to use and when to use it.
Yes.
Um,
That's been around for a number of years, and every year it's get better. They improve it, they revise it. If there's a new method or a new treatment, they include that, and it's got all the instructions. It's an incredible resource.
Steve's asking, Grant, will you mention again the site that your slides are going to be on or available?
Slideshare, one word, .net. And you'll just kind of have to use the words like EMBA and late winter, early spring management, put my name in there. Several will come up, but because that title page, that title slide, it's got today's date, March the 10th, it'll have that information. Then you'll know which one it is. And I haven't done that yet, just because today was one of these crazy days that I'll get to it. And it takes a little while to upload. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, it's 6:30 already. Tim Hyde's going to be on my case. I got to get this thing done. So
Another feeling.
when we're done here, I will load that. And usually it's up there pretty quick.
Okay.
Slideshare.net.
Slideshare.net. And thanks again for allowing us to record this so that we'll have it for the future. I think it's great. Our goal, Jennifer's asking, our goal is to produce honey. Let me see here. We have a strong colony, 9 seams, or 9, I guess she means 9 frames of bees in a deep that overwintered, and we want to prevent a swarm. There's an additional deep with drawn comb on top. What is our best route to prevent swarming?
More space, more cell space. There's a thing called checkerboarding that nobody does the correct way. But what we do is we pull frames, we kind of open up the brood nest and put frames, sometimes undrawn or drawn, in the middle of the brood nest. And of course, you can't do this too early because it's too cold, but you continue to expand this brood nest. And as long as you continue to expand this brood nest, the temptation to swarm is lessened. And then if you can get the bees into the nectar flow, then you can start to consolidate that brood nest. The demarrying process I really like. I like it better than the checkerboarding, which I've done for years. But it's to pull capped frames and put them above the super and put a frame of foundation. And the guy who designed this, named Edward Lloyd Seacrest, very specific when he says you got to put foundation, because the bees will start drawing that out for brood. If you put drawn comb, they start storing nectar there. And I think with a colony this strong, if you can reduce the swarming impulse and you've got drawn comb, they'll start filling those up with nectar, which isn't a bad thing if your extractor can handle the big frames.
A couple more questions here. It looks like the last one, because you've already talked about your thoughts on the flow hive and excluders. Looks like I am expanding my apiary to 5 different townships and counties. I have run into issues based from a lack of knowledge on their ordinances with planning and zoning from that city or county. Does the EMBA have a document stating where you either need a permit or permission from the city? And so I can state that no, the EMBA does not have any kind of form that I've ever seen with all the regulations for the different townships and counties and areas in St. Louis or the metro area. I would say there are so many that it would be difficult for us to compose a list that would be able to be updated on a regular basis, that you'll just have to check with your local areas that you're wanting to keep bees in. There's just so many areas that we don't have any kind of a document like that.
It sounds to me like he's talking about public or municipal owned property, the way I got around that, particularly when you have like a nature area that is run by the Missouri Department of Conservation, and they're very particular about who goes on there to hunt or cut trees or whatever, find an adjacent property owner that where you could put bees and let the bees trespass and fly over that boundary. I've never had a problem expanding. In fact, I've got more people who ask me about putting bees on their particular acreage than I've got hives to put on the acreage. When people find out you've got honey, I mean, people really want to be helpful because they think they're helping the bees by giving you a place to put them. The downside is they think 2 hives, oh my gosh, that's a lot. I don't know if our farm, it's 60,000 acres of rangeland and wildflowers. I don't think it could possibly support 2 colonies. But when I say, well, I like to go with about 12, they go, oh, okay. Have to talk to my wife about that.
Exactly. Looks like he said residential private property.
Oh, there shouldn't be any problem with that. If it's in town. See, one of the neat things about Southeast Missouri is we are so redneck, we've disbanded all the planning and zoning. So if you are outside of a municipality, you can probably do just about anything you want. And as long as it doesn't interfere with the neighbors, and I say do anything you want to, there's some common sense things you need to take care of. But inside a municipality, yeah, you've got some rules and regulations that, because I hear people say you can't, the city would have something like called setback. So you can't have a beehive within 40 feet of a property line, or you need 5 acres of lawn to put it on. I just work to find some, if those are the restrictions, I'd find somewhere else.
Exactly. They're asking here if I know of the next beginner discussion I can pass along to someone who's wanting to learn beekeeping. Off the top of your head, Grant, are you familiar with any upcoming beginner workshops online in like a Zoom format?
No. At the end of March, now, up here in Holden, which is just a little teeny tiny community, we've got an incredible veterans organization called Camp Valor. And we're trying to get veterans hooked up with beehives. There's something incredibly therapeutic about beehives and PTSD. And so I work with this fella. There's another retired pastor. He's working with this fella. We're trying to get a beginner bee class in person. And, again, all the protocols, the social distancing, all these things that just become just part of what we have to do in this day and age. We're trying to work through those complications and stuff, but that's the only one that I know of. But I think I think the MSBA would be a better resource to find out who's got that than you or me.
I agree. I know that the club, the EMBA, we hold our beginners workshop annually in February. So it's a one day a year event. And then we follow that with additional monthly meetings where we help try to educate. And so the next meeting is going to be scheduled for the 2nd Wednesday in April. And it will be nucleus colony introduction, how to do that, what to expect when you get your bees, not really covering all the specific details about what you would need to learn as a beginner. And so I would say that a search to the Missouri State Beekeeping Association, like Grant suggested, would be a good place to start. You might also check with Jane Sumi at Isabee's. She's got her ear to the ground and knows a lot of what's going on. And she might be aware of, or might even be hosting educational workshops herself. So that's where I would go. And it looks like, Grant, I think we've come to the end of our Q&A session. So
tell Bob Fink I'll back him on that flow hive argument.
I,
I see he's the one who asked that question.
well, he was the second person to ask the question, and I would probably be right between you two, equally supportive. I've never had one myself. I'll never have one. It just doesn't seem to be something that would go in or fit into my style of beekeeping.
But here, John, you do you, I'll do me.
Exactly.
If somebody wants to pay that kind of money for that, I will encourage them, but I'm not going to get one.
I agree. Okay, so I guess we're just a few minutes after the 9 o'clock hour. So Grant, thanks a million. It's been fantastic. We had several comments that I saw here, people expressing their thankfulness, and it's always a great time to get you to be able to come out and talk to us. So again, on behalf of everyone at the EMBA, I truly appreciate your time. And if there's anything else you want to leave us with, if not, we'll tune out for the rest of the evening here and catch everybody on the next meeting in April, second Wednesday of the month.
The only thing I would add is if anybody wants to send me an email to ask a question that they did get a chance to ask, or if there's something that needed to be clarified, it's gillardhoney@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to answer them. Other than that, I would have squandered this evening watching Netflix. I had a blast.
Well, good. Well, thanks again. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it. And we'll see everybody next month. And Grant, thanks a million.
You're very welcome.
Take care.
Yep.
Thanks, Grant.
You're very welcome. Now, I suppose if I just leave, I'll be done. So that's what I'm going to do. But yeah, Michael, thanks so much.
Keep up the good work.
All righty.